2,000 years ago, in a small province of the Roman Empire, a child was born in Bethlehem. He would grow up in Nazareth, he would preach in Galilee, and he would be crucified in Jerusalem. His name was Jesus. Jesus is not merely a historical figure, he is the Son of God, the promised Messiah, the Savior of the world. Christianity is not built on myth, it is rooted in history. The events described in the Gospels happened in real places, under real rulers, within the framework of the Roman Empire. When we talk about ancient history, it is important to remember something often overlooked. Many figures we consider unquestionably historical are known from only a handful of sources, sometimes written decades or even centuries after their lives. By contrast, Jesus of Nazareth is referenced not only in Christian writings but also in multiple independent sources from the 1st and early 2nd centuries. In fact, the documentary evidence for Jesus is stronger than that of many other ancient figures whose existence is rarely questioned, and that makes the historical case worth examining carefully. So what does the historical record tell us? What do Roman historians say about Jesus? What do Jewish sources record? What evidence exists outside the Bible? And how does archaeology confirm the world in which he lived? In this documentary, we will examine the historical evidence surrounding Jesus of Nazareth, not to replace faith, but to show that faith stands on a solid foundation. Let's begin. If we want to examine Jesus historically, the New Testament is our primary source. But what makes the case even stronger is that Jesus is not mentioned only in Christian writings. He also appears in the records of the Roman Empire, not in sermons, not in theological debates, but in the work of a Roman historian. And that is where we encounter one of the most powerful extra-biblical confirmations of Jesus. One of the most important non-Christian sources that mentions Jesus comes from a Roman historian writing in the early 2nd century. His name was Tacitus. Tacitus was not a minor writer or an obscure commentator. He was a Roman senator, a proconsul, and one of the most respected historians of the ancient world. Born around 56 AD, Tacitus grew up during the height of the Roman Empire. He lived through the reigns of multiple emperors and belonged to the political elite of Rome. This was not a distant observer writing centuries later. He was close to the center of power. Modern historians regard Tacitus as one of the most reliable Roman historians. He was known for his seriousness, his analytical tone, and his effort to document political events with precision. And that detail matters, because when Tacitus writes about events in the 1st century, he is not writing about ancient legend. He is documenting what, for him, was relatively recent history. Around the year 116 AD, he completed one of his major works, Annals, a detailed account of Roman emperors from Tiberius to Nero. It is in this political and historical work, not in a religious context, that Jesus is mentioned. In Book 15 of the Annals, Tacitus describes the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD during the reign of Emperor Nero. The fire devastated the city. Rumors spread that Nero himself had started it. To silence those rumors, Tacitus explains, Nero blamed a group already unpopular in Rome, Christians. And while explaining who these Christians were and where their name came from, Tacitus makes a brief but powerful historical statement. That is where he writes, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. In a single sentence, Tacitus confirms several key historical details. First, he acknowledges that Christ was a real person. Second, he states that Christ was executed. The phrase extreme penalty was a Roman expression for crucifixion. Third, he places the execution during the reign of Tiberius. And fourth, he identifies the Roman official responsible, Pontius Pilate. These are precise political references. This is not vague mythology, this is administrative language. We must remember, Tacitus is not defending Christianity. In fact, he clearly despises it. In the same passage, he refers to Christianity as a pernicious superstition. He describes Christians as a class hated for their abominations. This is not friendly testimony, which makes it even more significant because hostile sources rarely invent details that support the claims of those they oppose. Tacitus had no motive to help Christians. If anything, he had reason to diminish them. Yet he casually treats the execution of Christ under Pilate as an established historical fact. Why historians take this seriously? Tacitus was writing as a Roman senator with access to imperial record. As a former proconsul and member of Rome's elite, he moved within circles connected to the administrative machinery of the empire. When he refers to an execution carried out under a specific governor during a specific emperor's reign, he is speaking within a framework of documented Roman governance. This places Jesus squarely inside Roman political history. Not as legend, not as theological invention, but as a figure executed by state authority. The broader significance, notice something else. Tacitus does not explain who Jesus was in detail. He assumes his readers already know that Christians trace their name back to Christus. In other words, by the early 2nd century, the existence of Christ and his execution were common knowledge in Roman society. The movement had spread far enough that Rome itself had taken notice. And that is exactly why Nero targeted them. A Roman historian, writing decades after the crucifixion, hostile toward Christianity, yet confirming the existence of Jesus, his execution, the time period, the Roman authority responsible. That is powerful historical confirmation. And Tacitus is only the beginning, because Roman testimony is not the only non-Christian evidence we have. To understand the full picture, we must now turn to a Jewish historian of the 1st century. A Roman historian confirms the execution of Christ under Pontius Pilate, but Rome was not the only world aware of Jesus. If Jesus lived and was crucified in Judea, we should also expect traces of him within Jewish historical records. And that is exactly what we find. One of the most important Jewish historians of the 1st century was Flavius Josephus. Josephus was born around 37 AD, only a few years after the crucifixion of Jesus. He was a Jewish priest, a scholar, and later a historian who wrote extensively about the history of the Jewish people under Roman rule. After participating in the Jewish revolt against Rome, he eventually came under Roman patronage and dedicated his life to writing historical works. His most important book for our purposes is Antiquities of the Jews, completed around 93 or 94 AD. In this massive historical work, Josephus records political events, religious movements, and key figures of 1st century Judea. And within this work, he mentions Jesus. In one passage, often called the Testimonium Flavianum, Josephus writes about Jesus as a wise man, a doer of remarkable deeds, who was crucified under Pilate. Now, scholars debate whether parts of this passage were later embellished by Christian copyists. But here is what is important. The majority of historians agree that the core reference to Jesus is authentic. Even if later additions are removed, Josephus still acknowledges Jesus was a real person. He was known for extraordinary works. He attracted followers. He was condemned to crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. and Josephus mentions Jesus a second time, in a passage that is far less disputed. While describing the execution of a man named James, he identifies him as James, the brother of Jesus who was called Christ. That small sentence is incredibly significant. Josephus is not explaining who Jesus is. He assumes his readers already know. He simply uses Jesus as a reference point to identify James. That tells us something powerful. By the end of the 1st century, Jesus was already a recognized historical figure, known well enough to serve as an identifier. Why Josephus matters? Josephus was not a Christian. He never became a follower of Jesus. He wrote as a Jewish historian under Roman oversight. And yet he confirms Jesus lived, Jesus was crucified. Jesus had a brother named James. Jesus was known as the Christ. That is independent Jewish confirmation from the 1st century. So now we have a Roman historian confirming the execution of Christ, a Jewish historian acknowledging his life and crucifixion, two independent worlds, two independent testimonies, and both point to the same historical figure. But the evidence does not stop there, because Roman officials themselves left correspondence about the early Christians, and that leads us to another important name. By the end of the 1st century, both Roman and Jewish historians had acknowledged the existence of Jesus. But what happened next? If Jesus truly lived, was crucified, and left behind followers, what did the Roman authorities see in the decades that followed? For that we turn to another Roman voice, not a historian this time, but a governor. Pliny the Younger. Pliny was a Roman senator, lawyer, and provincial governor. Around the year 112 AD, he was appointed governor of Bithynia, a Roman province in what is now modern-day Turkey. While serving there, he encountered something that puzzled him: Christians. The movement had grown significantly, so much so that Pliny did not know how to handle them legally. And so he did what Roman officials often did when uncertain. He wrote to the emperor. Pliny sent a letter to Emperor Trajan asking for guidance on how to deal with Christians who refused to worship the Roman gods. Listen carefully to what he says. Others, whose names were given me by an informer, first said that they were Christians and afterwards denied it, declaring that they had been but were so no longer, some of them having recanted many years before, and more than one so long as 20 years back. They all worshipped your image and the statues of the deities, and cursed the name of Christ. But they declared that the sum of their guilt or their error only amounted to this, that on a stated day they had been accustomed to meet before daybreak and to recite a hymn among themselves to Christ, as though he were a god, and that so far from binding themselves by oath to commit any crime, their oath was to abstain from theft, robbery, adultery, and from breach of faith, and not to deny trust money placed in their keeping when called upon to deliver it. This is extraordinary. Pliny is describing organized Christian worship within about 80 years of the crucifixion. Notice what he does not say. He does not say Christians gathered to remember a legend. He does not describe a loose philosophical school. He describes structured worship centered on Christ. They sang to him as to a god. That is unmistakable language of devotion. And this is not written by a believer. Pliny is not sympathetic. He is frustrated. He is trying to determine whether Christianity is a criminal threat. Yet in his investigation, he unintentionally confirms the early worship of Christ, the moral seriousness of the community, the rapid spread of the movement. He even notes that temples were becoming deserted because people were turning to Christianity. This was not a small fringe group. It was affecting Roman religious life. The historical weight. Think about the timeline. Jesus was crucified sometime between 30 and 33 AD. Paul's letters begin circulating in the 50s, and by 112 AD, a Roman governor is reporting organized worship of Christ across Asia Minor. The belief in Christ's divinity did not slowly evolve over centuries. It was already embedded in the earliest generations, and it was visible enough that Rome took notice. So now we have a Roman historian confirming the execution, a Jewish historian acknowledging the man and his brother, a Roman governor describing worship of Christ as divine. Three independent voices. Tacitus was not the only Roman historian to reference the early Christian movement. Another Roman writer, roughly contemporary with him, also records disturbances connected to Christ. His name was Suetonius. Suetonius was a Roman historian and biographer who wrote the lives of the 12 Caesars around 120 AD. In his biography of Emperor Claudius, he makes a brief but intriguing statement. He writes, "Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome." Most scholars understand Chrestus to be a variant spelling of Christus. If this interpretation is correct, Suetonius is referring to disputes within the Jewish community in Rome over the message about Christ. That would place controversy about Jesus in Rome as early as the 40s AD, during the reign of Emperor Claudius. That is less than 20 years after the crucifixion. Notice the pattern. The message about Christ was not confined to Judea. It reached Rome rapidly. It caused division. It triggered political response. And Roman historians recorded it, again, not as myth, but as a social reality affecting imperial policy. By now we have Tacitus, execution under Pilate; Josephus, acknowledgement from Jewish history; Pliny, worship of Christ as divine; Suetonius, disturbances connected to Christ in Rome. Independent sources, different authors, different agendas, yet all intersecting around the same historical figure. And we still have additional sources we could examine. If you would like us to explore those, including lesser-known Roman and Jewish references, let us know, because the historical record surrounding Jesus is broader than many realize. When we step back and look at the evidence, something remarkable becomes clear. Roman historians, Jewish scholars, imperial governors, different cultures, different motives, different perspectives, yet all acknowledging the same central figure. Jesus of Nazareth was not a legend whispered centuries later. He was a real man in real history, living under Roman authority, crucified under Pontius Pilate, and remembered so powerfully that even his critics recorded his name. But history can only take us so far. Documents can confirm events, records can trace movements, letters can preserve testimony. Yet faith begins where history leaves us with a question. If Jesus truly lived, if he truly transformed the Roman world within a single generation, if men and women were willing to suffer rather than deny his name, then the question is no longer whether he existed. The question becomes, who is he to us? For Christians, the answer is not merely historical, it is personal. The same Jesus who walked the roads of Judea, who stood before Pilate, who was crucified under Roman authority, is the risen Lord. History confirms his presence in the past. Faith recognizes his presence today, and that is why the story of Jesus is not only the most documented story of the ancient world, it is the most transformative story in human history.